As a consequence of immigration, Britain has been rendered a hotbed of sectarian violence, and the British police, rather than police the perpetrators, those fomenting that division, they are cracking down on the second-order effects of it by censoring the people complaining about it. What I mean by this is a man has just been charged in the UK with an Islamic blasphemy law. Now, it's not an Islamic blasphemy law explicitly on the books, but de facto in application. This is Hamit Coskun, obviously not a man of British origin, but he was arrested in February 2025 after, and we say allegedly, but it is on camera, burning a Quran outside the Turkish Consulate in London in a protest against the Turkish President Erdoğan, and apparently in an act with solidarity with the Iraqi refugee Salwan Momika, who was murdered in Sweden in January for the same act of protest, with suspicions that a foreign government like the Iranians might have been involved in that. Now, he was charged under Section 31B of the Crime and Disorder Act 1998 with a racially or religiously aggravated public order offence under Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986. Now, it's absurd that we even have these charges in the first place, because all he did was burn a book in protest. But because he did it publicly, rather than in the privacy of his own home, he has been charged with causing offence to a racial or religious individual or group. Except, in this instance, the exact charge read as follows, and you can see it on screen. He was charged with intent to cause against the religious institution of Islam, in all caps, harassment, alarm, or distress displayed some writing, sign, or other visible representation which was threatening, abusive, or insulting, thereby causing that or another person harassment, alarm, or distress. He insulted Islam, and so he was charged with a public order offence. So we have an Islamic blasphemy law in this country. Now, his lawyer, Akua Reindorf, said that this was plainly defective because the religious institution of Islam was not a person for the purposes of the act. It would be no better if he had offended an individual person. I don't care if you're offended. You can burn any book you like under the laws and liberties that an Englishman expects himself to be subjected to. Bear in mind, the blasphemy laws brought in 1648 after the victory of Oliver Cromwell, sadly, in the English Civil War, were repealed as of 2008. But we know this isn't a blasphemy law, right? Because the concept of religious blasphemy is itself a Protestant and then liberal secular concept invented by the British Empire with their liberal norms and then put on steroids by the post-Blair Revolution in 1997 to govern all religions as if they are equal under the rubric of freedom of religion, rather than practicing a Christian tolerance of pagan faiths. So the creation of the sort of concept of religion was that Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity can all be worshipped privately under the same rubric of freedom of religion. But that presumes that those religions hold the same values as Christianity that led them to the point where a private observance of faith within a secular state was an acceptable compromise in affairs to allow people to live in harmony. No. The doctrine of Islam says all must submit. So you're not going to have those as compatible. But unfortunately, by removing blasphemy laws and enabling freedom of religion, you've now got a sort of sectarian infiltration by Islamic independent MPs and Islamic judges and activists and lobby groups that have been financed by the Muslim Brotherhood, like Hizb ut-Tahrir, now proscribed, who have set the agenda and softened government policy towards Islamism, jihadism, and Muslim sectarianism. And those who have entered the institutions, like these judges, like these activist lawyers, like these MPs, are now using Britain's anti-discrimination laws in partisan fashion on behalf of the interests of Islam as an institution, not just a personal group, against the settled, secular and Christian white British host majority. So, Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick wrote to the Chief Inspector and said that he needs to review the legality of the charge. The charge was then dropped on the 9th of May 2025, but replaced with a new and updated charge that has the same outcome. And a CPS spokesman said, "We charged Hammet Koskun on the basis that his actions caused harassment, alarm or distress, which is a criminal offence, it shouldn't be, and this was motivated by hostility towards a religious or racial group. As part of our continuous review of ongoing cases, we concluded the wording of the charge was incorrectly applied, and we have substituted a new charge to more accurately reflect the alleged offence. It shouldn't be offence in the first place. But Britain is governed in such a way where the police act as a protection racket to ensure the pristine reputation, even if unearned, of racial and religious minority groups remains in place, and any complaints by the host majority, who have to accommodate and pay for their presence, are suppressed violently. Now, this coincides with another story where a retired police officer was arrested. This is Julian Folks, who's a 71-year-old retired special constable from Gillingham in Kent. And he was arrested under the Malicious Communications Act and detained over a tweet in November 2023. Now, this has just come to light because the footage has been passed of police body cams to the Telegraph after the black mark on his record was recognised as a wrongdoing and expunged after he had to foot the bill for legal fees. The tweet he sent was on the 30th of October 2023, replying to someone who was criticising then Home Secretary Suella Braverman, who had called the pro-Hamas marches in Westminster and all other cities around the UK hate marches. He responded to an account called Mr. Ethical, who said, "Dear Suella Braverman, as someone who was on one of the hate marches, if you call me an anti-Semite, I will sue you." And Julian Folks said, "One step away from storming Heathrow looking for Jewish arrivals." Now, the police had interpreted that as anti-Jewish when he was criticising the man who went on the march as being akin to the Gestapo, for example. The tweet had only been viewed 26 times, but nevertheless, 6 police officers with pepper spray and batons knocked on his door and arrested him. And in the body cam footage that you can watch at the Telegraph, you can see the police going around his house, rifling through his belongings, picking up his 3 books by Douglas Murray and copies of The Spectator. And one female police officer, of course, picked up a Eurosceptic book and said, "What the hell is this? Very odd." They were looking for, quote, Brexity materials. So your opposition to being governed by unelected bureaucrats in the EU as a proxy for being concerned about the demographic, economic and cultural consequences of mass migration, of course, as Eric Kaufman has documented in White Shift, all of that is grounds for you to have your door knocked on by police, your private belongings rifled through, and for you to be taken to the police station and interrogated for 8 to 9 hours, and then you have to spend money on a lawyer to get that expunged about 18 months later. And they say two-tier policing in Britain doesn't exist. They were also apparently alarmed by the fact that there was a shopping list for bleach, tinfoil and gloves written by his wife, who's a hairdresser. What was he going to do? Go out and give random Syrian refugee children perms? This country's such a joke. Actually, it's not a joke. This is something like out of the first chapter of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. The arbitrariness of the arrest, the tactics used to frighten, shock and scare, the never knowing when or why you might have the police batten down your door and snatch you away in the middle of the night. That is what keeps people afraid, and that is what keeps a chilling effect on free speech in this country, which we legally do not have because people are being charged for offending the institution of Islam or Muslims individually or as a group. Now, during the footage, as well, this is quite disturbing, 15 years ago his daughter, Francesca, was killed by a drunk driver while on a holiday in Ibiza. Absolutely tragic. One of the police officers is going through the newspaper clippings that he kept of the inquiry into his daughter's deaths and of the funeral, and she goes, "Oh yeah, that's sad," and then continues searching his house. Why do you need to see any of this? It's absolutely grotesque. As he said, an Englishman's home is his castle. Well, unfortunately, English liberties and all of our castles are being laid siege. On Saturday, the 10th of May, a Kent police spokesman told the Telegraph the force had concluded the investigation and found that the caution against Mr. Folks was not appropriate in the circumstances and should not have been issued, and they're going to look for more learning opportunities in future. Now, bear in mind, I've had my run-ins with Kent Police before. In 2022 at Conservative Party conference, some fat Penfold-looking inspector misheard a conversation I was having with a local Birmingham journalist about another conversation that a woman was having with a Scottish street preacher about abortion and gay rights. And he had thought that I had called her sexuality insidious when she was straight. He had heard the word insidious, stormed over with an army of police officers, one with a shoulder-mounted camera, and threatened me with arrest under the Public Order Act. Never retracted, no apology. These people are ideologically corrupted. As Folks said, I never saw anything like this when I was in the force, but this woke mind virus is infecting everything and has definitely infected the police. Now, the purpose of a system is, of course, what it does, and this infection has now become the entire system's modus operandi. Sam Ashworth-Hayes wrote a really good article about this in The Telegraph this week, and he wrote, "Complaints about two-tier policing of actions and speech sting our politicians because they are plainly true. When West Yorkshire police sit in on a meeting in a mosque as a head teacher, mother and imam beg the community not to carry out the death threats sent to a child who scuffed a Quran, who then got the scuffing incident recorded as a hate incident, when the Batley Grammar School teacher is in hiding for his own protection while those who threaten him walk free, when police officers and counsellors in Rotherham and beyond insist that rape gangs preying on children need to be covered up to protect community cohesion, the state is showing you how it carries out its function of keeping the peace. As Britain has become more diverse, the state has reordered itself around this new reality. Nation-states, homogeneous and governed as such, slot neatly into cultural and institutional frameworks that allow for luxuries such as policing by consent of a single community. The incentives given by this model are perverse. If you set out with the goal of minimizing the risk of conflict between groups, then you will tend to police those who are easily policed, like the English, rather than those who infringe on the rights of others, like febrile sectarian Muslim communities with low impulse control, who are not operating along the guidelines of universal morality, but rather only doing that which advantages their family, their clan, and the broader ummah. He says, your rights, in other words, are directly related to the perceived threat of your group and that it poses. If you are largely peaceful, you will face the full force of the law as it attempts to avoid clashes between groups. If police officers are worried that a riot will result from confrontation, an offender will likely walk free. This is anarcho-tyranny. It is the unilateral application of laws against the law abiding, while the complete permission for criminal elements to run free and then to act as client groups for the state, who will then vote for this permissive state of affairs, while the law-abiding population is so petrified, they will also, perplexingly, vote for an increase in the remit of state power, so the state can clean up the mess that they themselves made, but then have no incentive to clean up the mess, because it entrenches the state of affairs that allows the state to exist as a kind of leviathan, making all of these fighting groups play nice. I wrote, in a recent column for Courage Media, the intent of Britain's institutions is to implement an apartheid system which penalises the white host majority to pursue equity and protect the feelings of imported minorities. Now, the Conservatives' response to this has been woeful. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp, who I usually quite like, has said he'll end the recording of non-crime hate incidents. The problem is, none of this was a non-crime hate incident. Neither was the incident where Telegraph journalist Alison Pearson had her door knocked on by Essex Police as part of a Met Police investigation for a potential terror charge for a deleted tweet about also the pro-Hamas marches. 12,000 people a year, 33 people a day, are arrested in Britain for grossly offensive speech, and this is under Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003 and Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act 1988. These are laws that were passed by previous Conservative and Labour governments, so Major and Blair and Thatcher including the Public Order Act 1986, which has now had these racial and religious hate crime charges slapped on top of it. All of these laws have to go. And if you're doing anything less than repealing these laws, you are not going to get anywhere. But what was most interesting was the ensuing blasphemy debate between Adnan Hussein and Rupert Lowe on Twitter. And this shows that we are going to be dealing with this downward pressure for reinstituting a blasphemy law on behalf of Islam for decades, thanks to the mass migration and multicultural management strategy conducted by multiple treacherous governments in succession. We all remember Tahir Ali last November telling Keir Starmer to make it a criminal offence to burn the texts of the Abrahamic religions. Now, he was referring to a UN resolution where it specifically said burning the Quran would be a crime, which ironically Britain voted against, but is now enforcing this as a law in its own country against the aforementioned protester outside the Turkish embassy. So Rupert Lowe responded to this entire scandal by saying, "This is Britain, we do not have blasphemy laws, and we must not have blasphemy laws. Burning the Quran is not a crime. Free speech means protecting the right to offend, including Islam. More politicians should have the courage to say so." Now, sadly, Rupert is incorrect. We do actually have blasphemy laws, it turns out, and this guy's probably going to get prosecuted. But he is right in the spirit of what he says. Adnan Hussein responded, and Adnan Hussein is the independent Muslim Gaza-obsessed MP who won his seat in Blackburn, heavy Muslim constituency, last July. Hussein said what Rupert actually wants to say is free speech means protecting the right to offend Muslims. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Adnan, for admitting that you want blasphemy laws. Now we know what we're up against. Lots of people then, obviously, me included, ratioed Adnan back to the 7th century. And he said, regarding Rupert Lowe, it is deeply worrying, Rupert, that you invest so much energy into advocating for the right to offend a minority community. Free speech comes with limitations and protections. Clearly, you're not happy with those protections extending to a Muslim minority. Why? And later, he issued a tweet saying, well, you wouldn't say a slur to a gay person. You wouldn't say a slur to a black person. Therefore, why are you allowed to offend Islam? Now, excuse me if I don't think that Adnan Hussein cares an awful lot about offending those other minority groups, those out-groups, especially when he is obsessed with Israel, for example, and so would defend the rights of Palestinian protesters, presumably, who engage in all sorts of anti-Semitic but violent rhetoric that they would happily direct towards the white indigenous host population of Britain, including myself, for our historic role in establishing the State of Israel and governing over Palestine. He would presumably defend the free speech rights of all those people. He would presumably defend the free speech rights of Kashmiri separatists who want an independently governed Kashmir, because that's a Pakistani issue of whom he shares a heritage with those people. So I don't think he cares one iota about the offence for other minority groups. I think he knows that these are vulnerabilities to the liberal system that existing anti-discrimination law tries to prevent. And so he can use it as a Trojan horse to insulate Islam from criticism. Bear in mind, Islamophobia, remember, was a term invented by the Muslim Brotherhood, as former jihadists have come out and said, who were present at the meetings, latching onto successful movements like campaigns against anti-Semitism or homophobia. So they generated the term, and it was then picked up and ran with by the Runnymede Trust in the UK in 1997, the year of Blair's election. And so if you've got a demographic constituency whose principal concern is about insulating their ethnic and religious identity from fair judgments and offensive comments, then if that constituency is always here, they are always going to use existing legislation to push towards an Islamic blasphemy law. And so what do we need to do? Get rid of all the legislation. Allow criticism of all religions, all peoples, all lifestyles, all politics to run completely free. Unfortunately, the narrative that diversity is our strength cannot abide by such scrutiny, and so I won't hold my breath for that to happen. However, positively, Rupert Lowe has signed a motion in Parliament defending freedom of speech and including the right to reject, mock or criticise religious ideas, including Islam. However, it's only been signed by Conservative MPs, three, Charlie Dewhurst, Peter Bedford and Bradley Thomas. There should be much more support thrown behind this. I know Katie Lamb's tweeted about this. I know Robert Jenrick's concerned about this. I know plenty of Conservative MPs are concerned about this. There needs to be a massive pushback against the predictable and ongoing enforcement of an Islamic blasphemy law in this country. And if this man is convicted for burning a Quran, it is a grave injustice. Sadly, though, in our rapidly Soviet-esque UK, it wouldn't be a surprise.